Canada thought it was buying security, but what it really bought might have been dependence. When Ottawa signed the billion-dollar deal to purchase the American-made F-35 fighter jets, it was told this was the only way to stay at the cutting edge of defense. The U.S. called it interoperability. Critics called it obedience. And now, as Sweden's Gripen E quietly rewrites the rules of modern air power, the question haunting Canada's skies is simple. Did we buy the wrong jet? While Washington warned of fallout if Canada dared to walk away, engineers in the small town of Linköping, Sweden, were building something extraordinary. A jet born not from money, but from necessity. What began as a quiet project to defend a small neutral nation is now shaking the world's most expensive weapons program to its core. This isn't just a story about airplanes. It's about pride, politics, and power. About how a $100 million machine became a symbol of control, and how a smaller nation just proved that independence can still fly higher than influence. Welcome to Dollar Under Fire, where we expose the battles behind the headlines.
When Canada first joined the F-35 program, the promise sounded unbeatable. The jet was sleek, stealthy, and backed by the most powerful military alliance on Earth. Ottawa's leaders painted it as a badge of honor, proof that Canada belonged at the elite table of NATO air power. But that badge came with a hidden price tag. By the time Canada's Auditor General crunched the numbers, costs had exploded far beyond the original estimate. Maintenance contracts stretched decades into the future, locking Canadian taxpayers into a program controlled from Washington. Even simple software updates required U.S. approval. Every flight plan, every weapons calibration, every radar signature was tied to American systems. The F-35 wasn't just a purchase. It was a surrender of autonomy disguised as progress. Still, politicians insisted there was no alternative. We can't risk being out of step with NATO, they said. The media repeated the same line. But quietly, away from the spotlight, another jet was taking shape. One that didn't demand loyalty, only logic. And that was happening not in the Pentagon or Lockheed Martin's skyscrapers, but in the calm precision of Sweden's Saab laboratories. What they built would soon prove that sometimes being smaller means seeing what the giants can't.
Sweden's engineers didn't have trillion-dollar budgets or vast foreign bases. What they had was clarity. Surrounded by Russia's shadow and centuries of neutrality, they understood one truth. Survival must never depend on permission. That mindset gave birth to the Gripen. The Gripen was never meant to dominate the globe. It was designed to keep Sweden safe. Light enough to operate from highways, quick enough to refuel in minutes, and smart enough to confuse enemies with information warfare instead of brute force. It didn't need fancy hangars or armies of technicians. It needed only a stretch of road and a handful of mechanics. Every bolt spoke of independence. The software belonged entirely to the operator. No foreign overrides, no locked code. Sweden's philosophy was simple. Build it so we can fix it ourselves. In a world where defense deals increasingly mean dependency, that idea was radical. By the time Canada opened its search for new jets, Saab entered the competition with quiet confidence. Few believed a Nordic underdog could stand against America's mighty F-35. But the Gripen had something no money could buy: purpose, built for self-reliance. Its proposal to Ottawa was straightforward: affordable to own, easy to operate, and free from foreign control. A jet for a nation that values its own decisions. And for a brief moment, it looked like Canada might choose independence over influence. But then, Washington noticed. What made the Gripen so different was not its speed, it was its philosophy. Where the F-35 relied on stealth to hide, the Gripen used electronic warfare to deceive. It didn't vanish from radar. It confused it. Enemy systems would see 100 phantoms and not know which was real. Pilots described it as fighting a ghost. Its lightweight frame and short runway capability meant it could launch from places that barely qualified as air bases. In Canada's north, where winter turns runways into ice fields, that was a game changer. It could land on highways, refuel in 10 minutes, and be airborne again before an F-35 even finished diagnostics. Even its maintenance cycle was revolutionary. A Gripen E can be serviced by a team of 6 in an hour. The F-35 often needs dozens of personnel and proprietary equipment just to open a panel. Saab designed its jet for a world where wars don't wait for paperwork. That philosophy made the Gripen ideal for nations with large borders and limited resources, like Canada. It was the jet built for harsh snow, frozen coastlines, and self-reliant people. But as the proposal moved through Ottawa, the whispers from Washington grew louder. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from capabilities to partnership obligations. And those two words would change everything. The idea of Canada buying a Swedish jet instead of an American one sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials warned Ottawa of the risks: lost data sharing, compromised training, reduced support. In reality, those were diplomatic words for punishment. Meetings turned into briefings, briefings into pressure. Ambassadors spoke of interoperability. Generals called it solidarity. Translation: buy American or pay the price. For Ottawa, the decision became a trap. Reject the F-35 and risk a rift with the U.S. Accept it and sacrifice control. Mark Carney's review of the contract was met with thinly veiled threats from Washington. And in the end, politics won over practicality. Canada announced it would buy the F-35. There were smiles in Washington, handshakes in Ottawa, and silence in Sweden. To most observers, the story was over. But then came a NATO training exercise in Europe that would flip everything upside down. What happened next stunned the entire defense world. During a NATO training exercise in Europe, the Swedish Gripen E was invited to fly alongside some of the most advanced jets on the planet: America's F-35 Lightning II, France's Rafale, and Britain's Eurofighter Typhoon. Military analysts expected the Gripen to perform decently, maybe even surprise a few pilots, but no one imagined what was about to unfold. When the exercise began, the Gripen didn't rely on stealth. It didn't try to hide. Instead, it manipulated the battlefield itself. Its electronic warfare system flooded radar networks with false signals, creating phantom aircraft across enemy screens. Missiles couldn't lock on. Tracking systems glitched. Pilots from other nations later said it felt like fighting a ghost that could think. The Gripen's radar deception worked so perfectly that even Allied control towers briefly thought the Swedish jet had vanished. What made this even more shocking was the cost difference. The Gripen E costs less than 1/3 of an F-35, yet it outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outperformed it under real combat conditions. Smaller, lighter, and faster, it didn't need stealth coatings or billion-dollar maintenance. It used pure engineering brilliance and adaptable software to dominate. By the end of the drills, the whispers had turned into open disbelief. Reports leaked that the Swedish fighter had embarrassed the F-35. One NATO officer called it the most efficient jet per dollar ever built. When those reports reached Ottawa, the silence was deafening. Canadian officials who once mocked the Gripen as too modest suddenly avoided interviews. Defense forums exploded with questions. Had Canada just rejected the perfect aircraft? The truth was undeniable. The underdog had just humiliated the giant.
And in that moment, the balance of air power quietly began to shift.
When the NATO results began circulating in defense circles, Ottawa could no longer pretend nothing had changed. The Gripen wasn't just competitive, it was rewriting what smart defense meant. Suddenly, every Canadian defense analyst, journalist, and former pilot had the same question on their lips. Did Canada choose the wrong jet? Within weeks, reports appeared in major newspapers exposing the growing unease within Parliament. The F-35, once praised as the pinnacle of innovation, now looked like a gilded cage. Its software was locked under U.S. control, its data routed through American servers, and even the simplest updates required Washington's approval. Canada had paid billions, but for a machine it didn't fully own. One editorial headline captured the national mood perfectly. Sweden offers the freedom we paid to lose. Across social media, videos of the Gripen landing on narrow highways in the snow and refueling in under 10 minutes went viral. Ordinary Canadians began to see what their government had ignored: a jet built for their geography, their weather, their independence. The Gripen wasn't a luxury project. It was a working jet for a working nation. Military veterans voiced their frustration. "We've traded autonomy for prestige," said one retired pilot. And prestige doesn't defend airspace. Even inside Parliament, quiet murmurs turned into pointed debates. This wasn't just about performance anymore. It was about identity. How could Canada call itself sovereign if it needed permission to fly its own missions? The realization hit hard. The F-35 gave Canada technology, but it took away control. The Gripen had offered both, performance and freedom. And as that truth sank in, so did a painful irony. The only thing Canada's F-35 truly achieved was proving how much independence had already been lost. While Canada wrestled with regret, the rest of the world was quietly taking notice. The same aircraft that Ottawa dismissed as an underdog was rapidly becoming the pride of smaller, independent nations. Brazil expanded its fleet, Hungary renewed its contracts, and Thailand entered new negotiations to buy more units. Each deal told the same story. Countries tired of being dependent on superpowers were finding freedom through Sweden's Gripen. In Europe, defense analysts began calling it the smart fighter for sovereign nations. Military think tanks cited it as proof that innovation no longer required a trillion-dollar budget or a U.S. blessing. The Gripen's modular design, easy maintenance, and independence from foreign control turned it into a case study in efficient defense strategy. Sweden's philosophy, that strength comes from control, not compliance, was catching on. What started as a Scandinavian experiment had become a global movement. Nations realized they didn't need to be beholden to massive alliances to defend themselves. They could own their aircraft, their systems, and their skies. The Gripen wasn't just a jet anymore. It was a political statement. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, frustration grew. Canada was tied to a jet it couldn't fully control, while smaller nations flew freely under their own command. Parliamentary committees debated the decision again, but by then, the contracts were sealed. Every new Gripen export deal felt like a reminder of what Canada gave up. The irony was brutal. Sweden, a country with a fraction of Canada's population and defense budget, had created an aircraft that not only challenged the world's most expensive fighter, but exposed how dependency weakens even powerful allies. And as the Gripen's global success soared, one question echoed through Ottawa's corridors: how did we let this one get away? By this point, the debate was no longer about which fighter jet was faster or stealthier. It had become a mirror reflecting something much deeper: Canada's struggle with sovereignty. The F-35 wasn't just a machine. It was a metaphor for how the country had tied its future to decisions made elsewhere. Every system update required foreign clearance. Every mission configuration had to pass through American channels. The illusion of control had replaced real independence. Canadians began remembering their own history, the era of the Avro Arrow, a homegrown jet so advanced that even the United States feared its potential. That project was canceled under political pressure, and decades later, the same pattern seemed to repeat itself. Once again, Canada had chosen to abandon innovation for alliance, autonomy for approval. In interviews, retired commanders voiced what many were thinking. The F-35 made us customers. The Gripen could have made us partners. Their frustration wasn't anti-American. It was about self-respect. The realization that a smaller, colder nation halfway across the world had captured the very values Canada once stood for, self-reliance, ingenuity, and quiet strength, was hard to ignore. Across Sweden, the Gripen had become a symbol of what smart defense looked like in the modern world: affordable, efficient, and free from political strings. In contrast, Canada's procurement seemed to represent the opposite: costly, complicated, and dependent. And so, the debate grew into something existential. What defines true strength? Cutting-edge technology, or the freedom to decide your own path? The Gripen had answered that question long ago. But for Canada, it lingered like a challenge in the cold northern air, a reminder that no alliance, no matter how powerful, can ever replace the value of standing on your own wings.
In the end, this story isn't really about Sweden or the F-35. It's about what kind of future Canada wants for itself. The Gripen proved that power isn't about how loud you roar or how much you spend. It's about how freely you can act. Sweden showed the world that true strength doesn't come from billion-dollar contracts or military dependence. It comes from the courage to build your own path, even when the world doubts you. Canada's decision to buy the F-35 wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of vision. The country that once led in aerospace innovation now rents its sovereignty one software update at a time. The irony is painful. The Gripen, a jet designed by a smaller, colder nation with fewer resources, embodies the very spirit of independence that once defined Canada itself. For many Canadians, the issue now goes beyond fighter jets. It's about national identity. The choice between being a customer or a creator, a follower or a leader. Sweden bet on itself and won. Canada bet on someone else and paid the price. As the Gripen continues to soar across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, its roar carries a message far louder than any engine, a reminder that freedom cannot be imported. It must be built, maintained, and protected. So perhaps the real question isn't whether the Gripen crushed the F-35. It's this: did Canada trade its independence for the illusion of security? Because in the skies above, where power and principle collide, one truth remains: technology can be bought, but sovereignty must be earned. This is Dollar Under Fire, exposing the hidden costs of power, pride, and politics. Tell us in the comments, did Canada make the right choice?